here today in Bungay in Suffolk, and behind me you can see the Church of St Mary's. Now on the 4th of August, on a Sunday morning in the year 1577, a great and terrible storm struck this place, and with it brought a ferocious demonic black dog. Now at the time the people believed that this was a manifestation of the devil himself. But since that day, many people in East Anglia have encountered a large black phantom dog. So today, join me as I search for Black Shuck. Stories about phantom black dogs can be found all over Britain. In Somerset, he's known as the Girt Dog. In Yorkshire, the Barghest. In Wakefield and Leeds, he's known as the Padfoot. And Moddy Doo is the name given to him on the Isle of Man. Now the phantom black dog does seem to get everywhere. However, it's in East Anglia where he is most often encountered. And around here he's known as Old Shuck or Black Shuck. Now here in Bungay, the people have embraced this story and celebrate the legend, and mentions of Black Shuck and the Black Dog of Bungay can be seen all around the town. So let's start, shall we, at having a look at what was said to have transpired in this church on the 4th of August 1577. Now we have a near contemporary account left to us by somebody called Abraham Fleming. Now he was a clergyman, a poet, a writer and a collector of manuscripts, and he gives us quite a thorough record of what he believes transpired in this building on the 4th of August 1577. So he opens his report by saying, "A strange and terrible wonder wrought very late in the parish church of Bungay, a town of no great distance from the city of Norwich, namely the 4th of this August in the year of our Lord 1577. In a great tempest of violent rain, lightning and thunder, the like whereof have been seldom seen, with the appearance of a horrible shaped thing, sensibly perceived of the people then and there assembled." Now he goes on to say, "There fell from heaven an exceeding great and terrible sudden violent between 9 of the clock in the morning and 10. On the day aforesaid this tempest took, beginning with a rain, which fell with a wonderful force, and with no less violence than abundance, which made the storm so much the more extreme and terrible. There were assembled at the same season in the parish church of the said town of Bungay, the people thereabouts inhabiting, who were witness to the strangeness and rareness and suddenness of the storm, consisting of rain violently falling, fearful dashes of lightning, and terrible cracks of thunder, which came with such unwonted force and power, the church did, as it were, quake and stagger, which struck into the hearts of those that were present such a sore and sudden fear, that they were in a manner robbed of their right wits. Immediately hereupon there appeared in a most horrible similitude and likeness to the congregation then there present, a dog, as they might discern it, of a black colour. At the sight thereof, together with the fearful flashes of fire which then were seen, moved such admiration in the minds of the assembly that they thought doomsday was already come. The black dog, or the devil in such a likeness, running all along the body of the church with great swiftness and incredible haste, among the people in a visible form and shape, passed between two persons as they were kneeling upon their knees, and occupied in prayer as it seemed, wrung the necks of them both at one instant clean backwards, in so much that even at a moment where they kneeled they strangely died. There was at the same time another wonder wrought, for the same black dog still continuing and remaining in one and the same self shape, passing by another man of the congregation in the church, gave him such a gripe on the back that therewith all he was presently drawn together and shrunk up, as it were a piece of leather scorched in a hot fire, or as the mouth of a purse or bag drawn together with a string. The man, albeit he was in so strange a taking, died not, but as it is thought is yet alive. Now we also hear about the fate of the church clerk. The clerk of the said church, being occupied in cleansing the gutter of the church with a violent clap of thunder, was smitten down, and beside his fall had no further harm. Now, according to Abraham Fleming, this devil dog left the marks of his claws on the church door. However, 111 years after this event, in 1688, there was a great fire which completely gutted the inside of this church. So we'll never actually know whether the devil dog did leave his claw marks on the church door, but there might be some more of that later. Now, with our rational, logical minds, nowadays we would of course associate the events that happened in 1577 with a terrible thunder and lightning storm, and the fact that the man was shrunk up, as it were, a piece of leather scorched in a hot fire, does make this very likely that he was struck by lightning. But for a superstitious congregation plunged into darkness in the church with a violent storm raging, which was quite probably at that time of year destroying the crops in the fields that had yet to be harvested, it's very easy to see how this event could have been interpreted in the way that it was. But none of that explains why people in East Anglia are still having regular encounters with phantom black dogs. There must be more to it than a mere thunderstorm. So, we're now in a local pub. Now, my intention was actually to do this section of the filming in a pub called the Three Tons, and I wish that I could have done that. The pub itself is actually closed today. It only now sadly opens on a Friday, Saturday and Sunday, I believe. But we were very fortunate because the landlord there gave us a private tour of the pub and told us many of the really interesting ghost stories and the things that happen there on a daily basis. So that was an absolutely amazing part of this trip, and I would love to go back there at some point when it's actually open. But anyway, we're not here to talk about ghosts, or are we? Because maybe Black Shuck is indeed a ghost dog. But let's carry on talking about Black Shuck. Now, there's a lot of history related to Black Shuck, and the earliest record about black dogs actually comes from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, from an account which happened in 1127. Now, this was an event experienced by the monks of Peterborough, but the story actually, although it mentions black dogs, it does actually sound a lot more like the Wild Hunt, which is obviously a story for another day. So let's hear what it says in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. These hunters were black and large and loathly, and their hounds were all black, with wide eyes and ugly, and they rode on black horses and on black bucks. This was seen in the very deer park of the town of Peterborough, and in all the woods from the same town to Stamford, and the monks heard the blast of the horns, which they blew in the night. So, whilst this account from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles does actually mention black dogs, the fact that there are several of them and that they accompany, I can't say that word, and that they accompany hunters does make them really quite different to the nature of Black Shuck, where he is a lone black dog. But there are in fact links to Anglo-Saxon times, and of course the area where Black Shuck is seen most frequently does have a lot of Anglo-Saxon history. So there's the possibility that the name Shuck actually comes from an Old English word, shucker, which means a demon or a devil. The word is actually mentioned once in the Beowulf poem. It could, of course, also come from the Old East Anglian dialect word shucky, which means shaggy or hairy. So wherever the name comes from, Black Shuck or Old Shuck continues to haunt the East Anglian landscape from the east coast right through to the Cambridgeshire fenlands. Now I've got a book here. It's a wonderful book. I was very happy to pick this book up. It was actually published in 1901 and it's called Highways and Byways in East Anglia by William A. Dutt. Now there is an account in here about Black Shuck which I'm going to read to you. If this were a stormy night instead of a stormy day, the old fisher folk of the coast would say it were just the time for Black Shuck to be abroad, for he revels in the roaring of the waves and loves to raise his awful voice above the howling of the gale. Black Shuck is the Moddy Doo of the Norfolk coast. He takes the form of a huge black dog and prowls along dark lanes and lonesome field footpaths, where, although his howling makes the hearer's blood run cold, his footfalls make no sound. You may know him at once, should you see him, by his fiery eye. He has but one, and that, like the Cyclops, is in the middle of his head. But such an encounter might bring you the worst of luck. It is even said that to meet him is to be warned that your death will occur before the end of the year. So you will do well to shut your eyes if you hear him howling. Shut them even if you are uncertain whether it is a dog fiend or the voice of the wind you hear. Should you never set eyes on our Norfolk snarly owl, you may perhaps doubt his existence, and like other learned folks, tell us that his story is nothing but the old Scandinavian myth of the Black Hound of Odin, brought to us by the Vikings who long ago settled down on the Norfolk coast. Scoffers at Black Shuck there have been in plenty, but now and again one of them has come home late on a dark stormy night, with terror written large on his ashen face, and after that night he has scoffed no more. So there's a few things I would like to say about this account from this book by William Dutt. Firstly, Mr. Dutt was not saying that in this area he has ever been called Moddy Doo. He's put that in inverted commas, and he's using that as a comparison with Moddy Doo from the Isle of Wight. Secondly, Black Shuck has never been known as Snarly Yow, and that's actually the name of a vicious ship's dog from an 1837 novel by Captain Frederick Myatt called Snarly Yow the Dog Fiend, obviously a dog that made a big impression. And thirdly, now this is interesting, I believe I have a fairly good level of knowledge about the Scandinavian myths and the Norse gods, and there has never been anywhere where Odin has a black dog. Yes, he has two wolves called Geri and Freki, and of course his two ravens, Hugin and Munin. The wolves are rarely mentioned, and they're wolves, not dogs, and there's two of them, not one. The only place it could possibly come from a Viking influence would be the goddess Hel, whose realm was guarded by either a wolf or a hound called Garm. But I think to say that this has anything to do with Odin is in fact, well, it's nonsense. Or as I'd say in Suffolk, a load of old squit. So there is a poem by Phyllis Noble where she says, "Down the long centuries he runs, haunting heath, holt and fen, for as of yore the hound of Thor may still be seen by men." Although that is a very nice poem, there is no connection between Thor and dogs at all. Thor had a couple of goats that pulled his chariot. There's no Thor-dog connection. So lastly, I want to talk about the description of the dog that William Dutt mentions in his book. Now he says that Black Shuck has one eye in the centre of his head. Well, this is not the usual way in which people see Black Shuck in the many encounters that there have been with him. Quite often there is something about the eyes, plural, of the dog which is noteworthy, but not always. In various stories the eyes have been described as fiery, glowing, sometimes saucer-like, which always makes me think of the Hans Christian Andersen story, The Tinderbox. Now there's an interesting story which happened in the early part of the 20th century. It was recounted by Mr. E. Ramsay of Blythburgh, which is just to the west of Norwich. Now he was young in those days and he'd been out to a darts match in Norwich, and he was making his way home on his bike back to his village. Now as he approached his village, sat by the village sign was the largest black dog that he had ever seen in his life, and he described it as having eyes like coals of fire. Now I don't know what I would have done if I'd have been riding back at night and seen a dog like that sat by my village sign. I think I'd probably turn around and find the long way home, but he was obviously a brave man and he continued past the dog. Now obviously he put a bit of speed on whilst he got past the dog to try and get as much distance between him and the hound. And then as he was cycling, when he'd gone about half a mile, to his utter horror, he heard the dog coming up behind him. He could hear its feet padding on the grit road. Now naturally, he thought that the dog was after him. Who wouldn't? But the dog passed him so close that he could smell its rankness. The dog went ahead of him a distance. And then, to his utter surprise, it stopped in the road next to a copse of trees, and it stopped and it turned and it faced him and it looked very aggressive. Now at this point, Mr. Ramsay, in utter fear obviously, got off his bike and stood with his bike to his right hand side up against the hedge. Now at this point, from the spinney, the copse of trees near where the dog was, an unlit car came roaring out of the spinney, careering down the road, right into the dog, ploughed straight into the place where the dog was, and then came careering down the road. Mr. Ramsay fell into the hedge with his bike on top of him. And then when he recovered his wits and pulled himself out of the hedge, he expected to see that the dog had been knocked over and killed by the car. So you can imagine his utter shock and surprise when he saw the dog was still there, completely unharmed. Now at this point his fear naturally returned, but then to his surprise the dog turned away from him and simply vanished into thin air. Now, as we heard in the account by William Duck, to see the dog was to know that you would die before the year was out. The legend actually says in this area that you would either die or a close family member would die. But there are other situations, such as the one we just heard, where the dog is helpful, where it protects in some way. Mr. Ramsay knew that without a doubt, if it hadn't have been for the dog, he would have been ploughed down by that out-of-control car on that night. So the dog saved his life. Unfortunately, Mr. Ramsay's wife did die 2 years after that encounter, and he did attribute that to having seen the dog. Okay, so let's talk about the size of the dog. Now, in this encounter with Mr. Ramsay, he described the dog as being extremely large. And in many of the legends and the encounters with the dog, he is described as being massively large, the size of a calf. The interesting thing, though, is that this isn't always the case. In about as equal a number of stories, the dog is a fairly normal size. So what is it about the dog that sets him apart from other perfectly normal dog encounters? In almost every case, there is something unworldly about the encounter. There is something unearthly, peculiar, or just downright paranormal, which makes the person realise the dog that they have encountered was not a normal dog. Sometimes, and this is an extremely big giveaway, the dog is headless, which would obviously be a very strange thing to encounter. Now, this is a very interesting account which displays this otherworldly quality perfectly, and it actually happened very close to where we are now. Now, this story was told by Mrs. A.M. Wilson. I shall read it to you. This incident happened some 60 years ago to my late father, and I heard the story from him more than once. The incident took place at Earsham one night slightly before Christmas and very near to midnight. Father had arrived in Bungay from Norwich shortly before 12 p.m. after finishing work in a Norwich bakery late. This left him to walk the last mile to the village. There was a thick snow on the ground and a bright, clear, moonlit sky. As he approached the last of the first row of cottages known as Temple Bar, he said he became aware of a horrible, cold, tingling sensation all over and a feeling that his hair was standing on end. He saw a large dog, probably black, come walking through the fence of the big private house known as the Elms on his right, cross the road in front of him a few feet away and disappeared through the wall of the rectory opposite. He found there was no sign whatsoever of any footprints or other marks on the fresh snow. At this point he panicked and ran fast as he could to my granny's house in the main street. At that time my father had no knowledge whatsoever of local ghosts, Bungay black dogs, etc. Now, this is but one of very many interesting sightings of Black Shuck that have been recorded. Now, if you've ever seen anything walk straight through a solid object, well, I can tell you from personal experience, it is pretty freaky, and I can completely understand why he legged it. Now, unlike the story that we heard earlier where the dog had an interaction with the person who witnessed it, in this situation it was almost like the dog was in a different reality to the person that saw it. There was no interaction at all between the witness and the dog. Okay, I think I've said enough about Black Shuck for now. Let's move on back to Beowulf the Van. So the story of that fateful day in 1577 did not end in Bungay. A very similar event happened about 11 miles south-southeast as the crow flies, in a place called Blythburgh, and here we can apparently see the claw marks of the demon dog on the church door. So we're actually going to be travelling some of the way on what is an old Roman road known as Stone Street. Now this road went from Caister St Edmund, which was the Iceni tribe headquarters known as Venta Icenorum, and it travelled down through Bungay, and we're going to be picking up the road and travelling along what is now the A144 down to Halesworth. Now the Roman road, we don't actually know where it went after Halesworth. Presumably it went there to cross the River Blythe, but we don't actually know where it went from there. So this is interesting, as the main place where Black Shuck is usually encountered by far and away is on roads, tracks, pathways. This is by far and away the most likely place to encounter him. Now, Bungay is on the old Roman road, Stone Street, and Blythburgh sits on the great medieval road which linked London with the East Coast ports. Now some people believe that Old Shuck travels along the spirit paths, also known as ley lines, dragon lines. Now this is an interesting concept which does warrant further research. If I didn't have to work for a living, then I would be quite inclined to pick up a pair of dowsing rods and check out all the places where Black Shuck has been encountered, because I think that could actually warrant very interesting results. With so many sightings where the black dog has crossed people's paths, providing no interaction with the witness, passing through solid objects, well, this in fact could make this a credible theory. Now spirits are known to pass along these routes, something I've had personal experience of. Anyway, we'd best get going. We've got to hit the road and get to Blythburgh. Black Shuck Roadtrip. Let's roll. So we've now arrived at the church at Blythburgh, Holy Trinity Church, and what an impressive building it is. You can see why it's known as the Cathedral of the Marshes. It's a little bit unclear from the evidence which of these attacks happened first, the one at Bungay or the one here at Blythburgh Church. From the website of the church it says, "Then in a great storm in August 1577, the church was struck by the hand of God, or was it the devil? During the morning service, lightning cleft the door and returning to the steeple, rent the timber, broke the chimes, and fled towards Bungay, 6 miles off, leaving on the great north door, clearly to be seen today, the fingerprints of the devil in scorch marks." And here they are. These are said to be the scorch marks left by the black dog, which was the devil. A man of 40 and a boy of 15 were found stark dead. Now, if we look to what Abraham Fleming said in his contemporary work of 1577, the like thing entered in the same shape and similitude, where placing himself upon a main bulk or beam, whereupon sometime the rood did stand, suddenly he gave a swing down through the church, and there also, as before, slew 2 men and a lad, and burned the hand of another person that was there among the rest of the company, and who divers were blasted. This mischief thus wrought, he flew with wonderful force, to not little fear of the assembly, out of the church in a hideous and hellish likeness. So whether or not the black dog did in fact leave his marks upon this door, as the legend tells us, we will never know. But what we do know is that stories of the black dog are still very much alive in this area. We're finishing the day at Blythburgh on the coast near Southwold. Now, there have been many sightings of black shuck here at Blythburgh. Perhaps one of the scariest stories is something that happened during the Second World War. An American airman and his wife had rented a flat-topped hut on the edge of Blythburgh Common. One night a storm blew up, and to their surprise and shock, they suddenly heard a pounding on their door. The airman peeped out of the window, and there he saw a huge black beast throwing itself at their home. They piled what little furniture they had against the door. The beast then went on to pound first one wall and then the other, and then it climbed onto the roof of the hut. This went on for hours. In the end, it finally subsided and the noise went away. In the cold light of day, the airman and his wife went outside and found absolutely no physical evidence that this event had ever happened at all. So I think you can agree that that was perhaps one of the scariest events that have involved black shuck. So we've now popped back over the Suffolk border, back in Cambridgeshire, in the farm where I grew up. Now, I was quite shocked and thrilled to discover that there are at least 3 stories recorded of black shuck in Suffolk. Now, 2 of them happened only about a mile from where I grew up. So I'm really quite excited to check them out. Now, the first one, which was recorded in a book about ghosts of Ely, happened to Mr. and Mrs. C.E. Fuller of Suffolk. They used to run the funeral parlour. In fact, it's still operating today. And this happened late in the 1970s as they were driving past the windmill in Downfields in Suffolk along what was then the A142. It's not the A142 anymore since the bypass was built in the early 80s. Now, they had to pull up sharply to avoid the great black dog which ran across their path straight in front of them by the Cherry Tree pub. Now, they watched anxiously for the dog to appear on the other side, but it had vanished. And it had vanished at the top of a trackway. As I said, it was a crossroads, the top of a trackway, Cherry Tree Lane, which heads off towards Wycombe. So let's go and have a look, shall we? Okay, so we're now in Suffolk on Cherry Tree Lane, right next to the Cherry Tree pub, and this is the direction that the dog was heading when he was spotted in the late 1970s by Mr. and Mrs. Fuller. Now, this is just a track and it heads off towards Wycombe. Now, taking the geography into account, this means that the dog crossed east to west and it is a crossroads. Now the other sighting which happened, it happened in the 1990s, around 95, 96 time, and that was on the Soham bypass, which is now the A142. Now, oh, I just got hit on the nose by something falling from the tree. Anyway, maybe I shouldn't be talking about the dog here. Anyway, let's carry on. So, a lady called Sally Sadler and her husband Patrick were driving back from Fordham and got onto the Soham bypass at Downfields roundabout. Now, very shortly after getting onto the bypass, they described an enormous dog which ran from east to west directly in front of their car, so close that they were sure that they must have hit it, but it just vanished, it disappeared. They described it as being rather like a Great Dane in shape, and if not actually black, then a very dark colour. Now, they both found the experience unnerving and thought that something just wasn't right. You know, to them it didn't seem like a normal dog. Not long afterwards, a close family member died. Now, Mrs. Sadler says that she doesn't connect this experience with the death of the family member. She was aware of the Shuck legend at the time, but had no interest in it and wasn't aware that there had been previous sightings of Shuck in this area. Now, that was recorded on the Shuckland website, which I'll mention at the end of the video. Now, it's worth noting that the location where the Sadlers saw the dog on the bypass is only about 750 metres from the location where we are now. And in both instances, the dog was travelling east to west. Now, east to west is obviously the alignment of the sun, the way the sun travels, and it's also the way that churches are aligned. So is there something significant about this east to west alignment? Now, the fact that all of this information has really got me thinking and quite excited about this. Now, you know, I know this area very well. I've walked it many times. Now I think of all the times I used to walk this area in the dark when I was a teenager. I think if I'd have known that Shuck was around, I might have thought twice about that, but I had no idea. And this is obviously a crossroads. Although this is an old track which goes off to Wicken, it forms a crossroads with Regal Lane and also Fordham Road. Now, the bypass was finished off in 1981. My personal thought is, they said that they'd just got onto the bypass. Now, there is an old track which I know very well because it connects up with my dad's farm, and I've often walked that track to walk from the farm into Soham. Because the bypass was built across the track, it has effectively formed a crossroads, and it is literally just a few, I don't know how many yards, but not very far after you get onto the bypass from the roundabout, there is the crossroads formed by the old track. Now, this takes me back to the ancient pathways theory and also crossroads. And one of the places that are noted as being a Shuck hotspot are in fact crossroads. And it seems to be the case for these two Soham sightings. Now, when we look at the folklore connected with crossroads, they are considered to be liminal spaces, places between the worlds where ghosts are often seen and paranormal activities happen. They're also places associated with death. Obviously, in days gone by, people that had committed suicide would be buried at the crossroads. They're places where gibbets were often erected, and you know, these are considered to be liminal spaces. Also, in Greek myth, they were considered to be sacred to the goddess Hecate, and shrines were erected at crossroads for her. And very interestingly, the animal associated with the goddess Hecate is the black dog. Now, before I finish this video, I would like to tell you a story about Black Shuck, which I only found out about yesterday, and as far as I know, it's never been recorded anywhere ever before. It was told to my mum yesterday by one of her friends. So, my mum's friend saw Black Shuck. This happened on the 8th of September 1993. Now, she'd been visiting friends in Burwell, which is just over yonder somewhere. It got to evening time and she was returning from Burwell back to Fordham. She lived in Soham, still does, and she was taking the road, Ness Road, from Burwell to Fordham. Now, it was dusky, she'd got her lights on in her car, and she saw coming up behind her what she thought were lights approaching from a vehicle. She then became aware of an animal on the grass verge running next to her car. Now, she obviously slowed down because she thought the animal may swerve in front of her. She then became aware that it was a very, very large black dog. She described it as being the size of a donkey, and it had glowing eyes. The lights that she had seen were actually the dog's eyes. Now, as she was driving along in her car, the dog was running by the side. She was obviously going quite slow. It turned and it looked at her as she was in her car. And then she tells me that the dog just disappeared. It just simply vanished into thin air. Now, she drove along, she stopped in Fordham on Station Road by the old school. She was shaken, she was trembling. She had to stop to get her, to pull herself together because she was in a state of shock. Now, we've heard before how Shuck can be a portent of death, and in this situation, this is exactly what happened, because exactly 10 days later, my mum's friend's auntie, who lived with her, died suddenly. So, I hope you have enjoyed this video about Black Shuck. We've been to some of the places where the Shuck legend exists and where people are still seeing Shuck to this day. I actually had no idea at all until I started researching this, that there have been Shuck sightings around here so close to where I come from. I definitely think that this whole thing needs more research, and it's been something I've really enjoyed looking into. So watch out when you're out in dark lanes and ancient trackways around East Anglia, because you might just encounter Shuck.